Hello everyone. Today in our video we'll be discussing about the pharynx and its subdivisions. So let's get started. Now, what is pharynx? Pharynx is a funnel-shaped fibromuscular tube extending from the base of the skull to the esophagus. So it is a fibromuscular tube, funnel-shaped and extending from the base of the skull to the esophagus. So it is completely surrounded by mucous membrane. So the pharynx acts as a common channel, as we all know this before. It acts as a common channel for food and air, right? So what is the length of the pharynx? So the length of the pharynx is nearly, so pharynx length means from here to here. So it is quite nearly like 12 to 14 centimeter. Okay, so width of the pharynx in the sense here. So this is the base part. Base is always a little bit wider than the apex. So base part of the pharynx is about 3.5 centimeter, and this is the apex, maybe we can say it like that. So towards the esophagus part, when you come below, its width is about 1.5 centimeter. And where it is located? So it is located definitely, as you can see, behind the nasal cavity. This is behind the nasal cavity, behind the oral cavity, and behind the larynx. Okay, now let us study about the boundaries and relationships of the pharynx. Yeah. Now, as I told you already, the extent of pharynx is from the base of the skull till the esophagus. But when you see about the boundary of the pharynx, we really have to learn it in detail, right? So the superior part is actually formed by the base of the skull, but to be very specific, the superior part of the pharynx is actually formed by the posterior part of the body of the sphenoid. So posterior part of the body of the sphenoid, so this part, this is the sphenoid bone, the yellow color thing. This is the sphenoid bone. The yellow color whole thing is the sphenoid bone. This is the posterior part of the body of the sphenoid. So you can just visualize in your mind like this is the pharynx. So it is extending from here. This is the superior part of the pharynx you're seeing. So from here to the basilar part of the occipital bone of the in front of the occipital bone in front of the pharyngeal tubercle. So pharyngeal tubercle is something which is present here. Is a tubercle means a protrusion. So this is the pharyngeal tubercle and it is extending from here to in front of the pharyngeal tubercle. So this is the superior boundary of the pharynx. Now what is the inferior boundary of the pharynx? The inferior boundary is very easy. Anteriorly, when you're talking about the inferior boundary, it is still the cricoid cartilage, the lower part of the cricoid. This is the cricoid cartilage. As you can see, it is labeled cricoid cartilage, lower part of the cricoid cartilage, anteriorly and posteriorly to the lower part of the C6 vertebra. Okay, so this is the inferior boundary. So now what about the posterior boundary? Posterior boundary, you can see it is actually formed by the definitely by the vertebral spine, but in front of the vertebral spine there is a fascia called prevertebral fascia. It is not labeled here, so it is called as prevertebral fascia, which will be something like this here in between this. So this is called as prevertebral fascia. So we all can feel our pharynx actually when we are swallowing the food. We don't feel any bony obstruction, right? So it is because between the prevertebral fascia and the pharyngeal wall. So this is the pharyngeal wall, let me say. This is the prevertebral fascia. Okay. So now between this there is some loose areolar tissue present. So that's why when you're swallowing you don't feel any bony obstructions because there are vertebral spine present here, right? Now going to the anterior wall. Anterior wall, as I told you already, definitely the cavities. That is the nasal cavities, um, oral cavity, and the larynx. So these are the three cavities anteriorly when we are seeing in common. Now laterally, when you're speaking, it has neurovascular bundle of neck and sterile process with its attached muscles and ligaments. Okay, now when you're going to the subdivisions. So subdivisions are very easy to study, like they are very important part. So the part of the pharynx behind the nasal cavity is called as nasopharynx. The part of the pharynx behind the oral cavity is oropharynx. The part of the uh, pharynx which is present behind the larynx is called laryngopharynx. It is written as hypopharynx, but can be also said as laryngopharynx. Okay, now we're going to be studying deeply about first part, that is the nasopharynx. So nasopharynx, as I told you before, it is a part of the pharynx that is behind the nasal cavity, right? So what is the boundary of the nasopharynx? So nasopharynx, as I've told you earlier, it is present so behind the nasal cavity. So when you're talking about the boundary, the roof of the nasopharynx is definitely the roof of the pharynx entirely, right? So roof of the pharynx is what? It is the body of the sphenoid and the basilar part of the occipital bone, as I've told you here, right? Body of the sphenoid and the basilar part of the occipital bone. Now this is the roof. Now when you see roof, next is floor. Floor is actually formed by the palate, that is a soft palate. So maybe in this picture you can see it clearly. This is the soft palate. So this is the flow, so from here to here, right? So this is the body of the sphenoid and the basilar part of the occipital bone, everything, and here the soft palate. And one more thing, pharyngeal isthmus. So this space is called as pharyngeal isthmus. Okay, so what is pharyngeal isthmus? From here itself you can say it clearly. From the free, it is a space between the free edge of the soft palate, posterior free edge of the soft palate, and the anterior wall of the pharyngeal wall, anterior part of the pharyngeal wall. So it is quite easy, right? Or the posterior pharyngeal wall, you can say. Now about the walls of the nasopharynx. So when you see about the walls of the nasopharynx, there is anterior wall, posterior wall, and two lateral walls, right? So now anterior wall is actually, we have a good picture. So this is about the anterior walls of the three parts of the pharynx. So this is a nasopharynx. So anterior wall is formed by the posterior nasal aperture. So this is the posterior nasal aperture. This whole thing is posterior nasal aperture. So the posterior wall is actually formed by the the vertebra, that is the C1 vertebra, anterior arch of the C1 vertebra. So this is the anterior arch, you can see anterior arch of the C1 vertebra. This is the posterior wall boundary. And now about the lateral wall. So lateral wall is actually formed by the medial pterygoid plate of the sphenoid. So medial pterygoid plate of the sphenoid, in the sense, this is the medial pterygoid plate of the sphenoid, this part. This is the medial pterygoid plate of the sphenoid. This is the lateral pterygoid plate of the sphenoid. So laterally, when you have to just visualize when I'm saying, okay, only then you can learn easily, understand easily. So lateral wall of the medial pterygoid plate of the sphenoid. Now we are going to study about the main features of the nasopharynx. So the first feature of the nasopharynx is a nasopharyngeal tonsil. So nasopharyngeal tonsil, or it is also called as pharyngeal tonsil. So tonsil is actually a secondary lymphoid organ. So definitely it will be composed of lymphoidal tissue beneath the mucous membrane. So it is present in the junction between the it is actually present in the junction between the upper and the posterior roof of the pharynx, nasopharynx, sorry. Upper and posterior roof. This is the upper roof, posterior roof. So it is present in the junction between the upper and the posterior roof. And there is a small protrusion in between. You can see it is called as nasopharyngeal bursa. It is called as nasopharyngeal bursa. And in some people, there is a dimple present in the mucous membrane of this pharyngeal tonsil, and it is called as Rathke's pouch. Rathke's pouch, right? Now again, in another one important feature, that is the orifice of the pharyngotympanic tube. So orifice of the pharyngotympanic tube, for that yeah, so this is the orifice of the pharyngotympanic tube. That is, it is a connection between the auditory tube of the ear and the pharynx, so that when you're putting any ear drops in your ear, you can feel some kind of sour taste in your throat. It's because of this connection, actually, opening of the auditory tube or orifice of the pharyngotympanic tube. So it is present at the level of the inferior concha, inferior nasal concha. So this is the inferior nasal concha. This is a superior nasal concha. You can see some two protrusion. So this is the inferior. This is the inferior nasal concha. It's two, and this two are the superior nasal concha. So it is present at the level of the inferior nasal concha, and little bit 1.25 centimeter behind the inferior nasal concha is this opening of the auditory tube, and it is actually having an upper and a posterior margin. These margins are bit elevated. So this elevation is actually produced due to the collection of the lymphoid tissue. so that it is called as tubal tonsil. Tubal tonsil. So tubal tonsil, right? You know this tonsil spelling. Okay. Now the two folds actually extend from this elevation, and there is two fold from this part, that is salpingo pharyngeal fold and salpingo-palatine fold. So salpingo-pharyngeal fold is something which is here. This is salpingo-pharyngeal fold, which actually goes vertically downwards and then fades away. So it is actually containing muscle called salpingopharyngeus muscle. And again, another one more fold is also there, that is salpingo-palatine fold. Salpingo-palatine fold is actually an extend. It is actually extending downward and forward, and it is actually containing a muscle called levator palatine muscle. So this is the again another one peculiarity. Third important feature of nasopharynx is the pharyngeal recess. So pharyngeal recess, the name recess means, so recess R E C E, yes. The word recess means some depression or some space. So it is a kind of a space in the pharynx behind this tubal elevation. So behind this tubal elevation is not shown in this picture, but it is actually present behind this tubal elevation, and it is also called as fossa of Rosenmuller. Fossa of Rosenmuller. So this whole nasopharynx, it actually has an kind of resembles nose, and so it is lined by pseudo-stratified ciliated columnar epithelium. Pseudo-stratified ciliated columnar epithelium. And there is a peculiarity in this part of the pharynx. It is called as Pazavins ridge. So Pazavins ridge. So it is called as Pazavins ridge. What is Pazavins ridge? So we'll be seeing about the Pazavins ridge. So Pazavins ridge is actually formed by the muscle, that is the palatopharyngeus muscle, green in color. So palatopharyngeus muscle, which is sweeping horizontally backwards, joins with the upper fibers of the superior constrictor muscles. This is the superior constrictor muscle, upper fibers of the superior constrictor muscle. It is joining with this, and it is forming a U-shaped fold, muscular loop, or okay. So in the it is forming a U-shaped muscular fold in the posterior pharyngeal wall. So when a person is swallowing the food, what happens is that this fold actually, it goes little forward like this, goes forward. This fold goes forward, and thus what happens is, suppose this is the person is swallowing, got it? So the person is swallowing some food. So while swallowing the food, this is a part of this Pazavans ridge, and it actually comes like this. It goes forward. This part goes forward, and this the soft palate elevates. So it elevates in the sense it becomes a little bit straight like this. So therefore, it just completely closes this pharyngeal isthmus. Remember pharyngeal isthmus. This part is completely closed during swallowing. Okay, and so it is called as palatopharyngeal isthmus. Palatopharyngeal isthmus or palatopharyngeal sphincter, because it is closing during eating, right? So it is called as palatopharyngeal sphincter. Now next we are going to the next pharynx, that is the oropharynx. The oropharynx is the second part. This is the oropharynx. So this is the oropharynx part. So it gets the name because it is behind the oral cavity. And when you see about the extent, it's very simple. From the sloping border of the soft palate till the upper tip of the epiglottis. So this is the extent. So when you're seeing about the boundaries, it is quite simple. The boundaries, as I told you, definitely the boundaries will be like roof. Roof will be formed by soft palate and the pharyngeal isthmus. So this is a pharyngeal isthmus. This is a soft palate. Okay, so this is the roof, and the floor. Floor will be formed by the posterior 1/3 of the tongue and the interval between the tongue and the epiglottis. So this is the thing. The epiglottis, interval between the tongue and the epiglottis. So this is the floor. It is the floor of the oropharynx. Okay, now about the walls, that is anterior wall, posterior wall, and two lateral wall. So anterior wall is formed by definitely it is formed by the 1 minute. Yeah. So anterior wall is formed by the oropharyngeal isthmus. So definitely the oropharyngeal isthmus is actually a space. This is the oropharyngeal isthmus. This part you can see, this is the oropharyngeal isthmus. So this is the anterior wall. Whatever you see in this picture here, it is forming the anterior wall, oropharyngeal isthmus, and the pharyngeal part of the tongue. That is, tongue will be somewhere inside also, inside the pharynx also. That is called pharyngeal part of the tongue. So that is the anterior wall boundary. And coming to the posterior wall boundary, it is formed by the C2, body of the C2 vertebra. And so body of the C2 vertebra, this is the C2 vertebra, body of the C2 vertebra, and the upper border of the C3 vertebra also. So body of C2 vertebra and upper border of C3 vertebra. Okay, now we are going to see about the features of this oropharynx. So when you come to the oropharynx, it is having features in its lateral wall and its anterior wall. So what is a feature in its lateral wall? So the feature in lateral wall is this part, that is the palatine tonsil. So there is something called palatine tonsil, which you can see in this picture. Palatine tonsil. So it is present in the triangular fossa or depression, and that depression is called as tonsillar fossa. Okay, so this is a peculiarity about the lateral wall. And coming to the anterior wall, so when you see about the anterior wall, so when you see about the anterior wall, it is having some okay. So when you see about the anterior wall, there is some nodular protrusion in the dorsum, the posterior 1/3 of the dorsum of the tongue. This nodular protrusion is called as lingual tonsil. And it is also formed by lymph tissues. Okay, this is one, and this is the first peculiarity feature of the uh, of the anterior wall. And the next peculiarity about the anterior wall is that it has upper free border of the epiglottis. So epiglottis will be actually below, but for showing you, I'm just showing you here. Epiglottis will be there. So this is the epiglottis. Maybe we can just keep it like that. This is the epiglottis, and the median and lateral glossoepiglottic fold. So median and lateral glossoepiglottic fold. Yeah. So yeah, this is the median glossoepiglottic fold. This is the two lateral glossoepiglottic fold. So this is again another peculiarity in the anterior wall of the oropharynx. And the epiglottic valleculae. What is epiglottic valleculae? This is the depression between the median and the two lateral um, folds, glossoepiglottic folds. So this depression, this part, this depressed part is called as valleculae. It is also called as epiglottic valleculae. Okay. Now we are going to see about one important thing called as oropharyngeal isthmus. So this is the oropharyngeal isthmus. It is very simple. So oropharyngeal isthmus, simply in commonly speaking, it is just a junction between the oral cavity and the pharynx. But to be specifically talking, it is actually bounded above by the soft palate, and below by the dorsal surface of the posterior one third of the tongue, that is dorsum of the tongue, and laterally by the palatopharyngeal arch. This is the palatopharyngeal arch. Right? Now we are going to the last part of the pharynx, that is the laryngopharynx. So laryngopharynx, as you can see, as the name indicates, it is just behind the larynx. So this is called as laryngopharynx. So what is the extent of the laryngopharynx? Anteriorly, it is extending from the laryngeal inlet. This is the laryngeal inlet, as you can see, till okay. So this is the laryngeal inlet. I'm sorry, I have done it here. So, or you can see the not only laryngeal inlet, it is anteriorly from the tip of the epiglottis, actually tip of the epiglottis till the lower border of the cricoid cartilage. This is the cricoid cartilage. So from here to here it extends anteriorly. Posteriorly it is bounded by the C3, C4, C5, C6 vertebra. It's quite easy to study this. And what is the boundary? Boundary anteriorly, I have told you already, the laryngeal inlet. That is, this is the laryngeal inlet and the posterior surface of the larynx. So this is the larynx. So this is the posterior surface of the larynx. This completely forms, so posterior surface of the larynx and the epiglottis, laryngeal inlet, everything can say for anterior wall. Posterior wall, definitely as I told you, C3, C4, C5, C6 vertebra. So lateral wall is actually formed by thyroid cartilage and thyrohyoid cartilage. So thyroid cartilage is seen here. So laterally, it is not a lateral view. This is a lateral view, but still you can't see the lateral wall, right? So lateral cartilage is formed, thyroid cartilage is formed in the lateral wall, and one more cartilage, that is thyrohyoid cartilage, is also forming the thyroid membrane is forming the lateral wall. Now, again, when you're going to see about the features, definitely it has some specific features in its lateral wall and anterior wall. So in anterior wall, the important feature is definitely the laryngeal inlet. This is the laryngeal inlet. Then the cricoid cartilage, this part, and the arytenoid cartilage. So this is the anterior wall's peculiarities or the features of the anterior wall. What is that? Laryngeal inlet, arytenoid cartilage, and cricoid cartilage. So in its lateral wall, there are two pyriform fossa on either side of the laryngeal inlet. which is not seen in this picture. So there are two pyriform fossa present on either side of the laryngeal inlet. That is a feature of the lateral wall. So that's the end of the video. I'll be talking about this pharynx part 2 in another video. If you like this video, please like, share and subscribe to my YouTube channel. And yeah, thank you guys. For further more videos, I would want you to like, share and subscribe to my YouTube channel. And if there is any suggestions, you can bring your suggestions in the comment section below. And only if you subscribe and hit the bell icon, you can actually get all of my videos about the medical, about some common things, so in our YouTube channel Rise and Wise. Thank you guys.